from the point of view of pattern differentiation, just like to ask a fairly basic question on Shang theory that I'd like to get your opinion on. Since the general consensus is that the Shanghanlun represents kind of a progression of disease. I don't want to say would all disease be considered from starting at the Taiyang stage, but I guess perhaps could we consider that most diseases using Shanghanlun theory do in fact begin at the Taiyang stage?
No, not necessarily, because you have to remember that Shanghanlun already is conceiving of the concept of a direct strike. And although there's some debate over how to read the lines in question, depending on how you read certain lines, like that would be, what is that one again? Line. It's wave 7, if I'm remembering my line numbers right. But the line that says, let's see, there are illnesses, or there are patients, you could read it actually probably better. There are patients who have aversion to cold and heat effusion. This is the illness emerging in the yang. And there are patients where there is aversion to cold and no fever. This is the illness emerging in the yin. Now, some people read that as referring to the difference between a Ma Huang Tang pattern and a Gui Tang pattern, between cold damage in the narrow sense and wind strike. And there are some good arguments for that, actually. The other and more common way it's read, though, is that emerging in the yang means emerging in the Taiyang, emerging in the yin means emerging in the Shaoyin. Because there's a long history of holding that that if a person has yang vacuity, that when they get cold damage, it will probably go straight into the Shaoyin. And so, no, I would say that you don't necessarily need to worry about the progression being in that order, because there are many reasons why it might happen other ways around. Again, if you look at Zhang Yuansu and Wang Haogu, Zhang Yuansu was Li Dongyuan's teacher, Wang Haogu was one of his students. They both conceive of internal damage to the spleen and stomach as being about damage to the yin channels. And they talk about, Taiyin internal damage, Shaoyin internal damage, Jueyin internal damage. And there are some echoes of this in Li Dongyuan's works, although he does not ever pin it down quite so precisely. One of the curious things about his work is that he refers to this idea of yin fire, which I'm increasingly inclined to think that what he means by yin fire is the 3 yin of the Shanghanlun, or at least it seems to be what Zhang Yuansu understood by that kind of a term. But nothing in the surviving works of Li Dongyuan makes it clear what that yin really is. It's a very fuzzy, amorphous term in his works. But if you look at, for instance, in one section where he gives 5 formulae for treating internal damage, sort of basic formulae for treating the spleen when it's been damaged, and he's clearly breaking them out according to what else has been damaged along with it. So, for instance, you see Xiaojin Zhongtang emerging for when the spleen is being damaged, and there's also liver patterns accompanying it, basically. So I do think that whether or not he meant that in a very literal sense or not, clearly he is thinking in those terms of the illness emerging in the yin channels and how do we deal with this. So I think really the best way to think of it is to have a very flexible approach to how you think of these illnesses, because even a true cold damage, an invasion of wind and cold, doesn't have to come through Taiyang first, although it usually does, but it can directly strike one of the other channels. And certain things, of course, like summer heat, for example, usually strikes directly at the Yangming. And, damp heat frequently strikes directly at the Taiyin. So, I mean, you have these variations where it's useful to think of them that way rather than to think of it as a linear progression.
Thank you for that clarification. So you had mentioned a little, a few minutes ago, Yi Yin and his Tang Ye Jing. Can you give a synopsis on what that work is for those people who might not be familiar with it, and why it is so important with regard to the Shanghan Lun and the theories therein.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing to know is, for a long, long time, no one knew what was in Yin's canonical methods of decoctions. The Tang Ye Jing Fa is its full name. And that's because it was mentioned in the bibliographic treatise of the Book of the Han History, in a category called classical formulas or canonical formulas. Not the same category, it's worth noting, that the Huangdi Neijing appeared in that book. It was put in a different one. But it didn't survive. We didn't have anything, we didn't even have any certain quotes from it that we knew for sure. We had the references like Huang Fumi saying that Zhong Jing's work was based upon it, but we didn't have the original text. And it went so far that even in the early 20th century, there's a book you'll see, what did he call his exactly again? Oh, I think he calls something like Tang Ye Jing or something like that. There's an early 20th century writer who attempts to reconstruct the Tang Ye Jing Fa from the Shanghan Lun, and does some very interesting stuff, which all turned out to be wrong. But it wasn't his fault. He was very clever, but he just was wrong. Because in the end, what happened is there's a vast stash of manuscripts that was discovered in the middle of the desert in what's now Gansu province at a place called Dunhuang, which if you ever get to go, you should go. It's fabulously beautiful. This stash of text had been sealed up in a small cave off the side of one of the main cave sanctuaries, because these are all sanctuaries carved into the cliff face here. And they're Buddhist, all of them. But within this little cave, there were a whole treasure trove of documents going back as far as even before the Tang, in some cases, and leading up to the end of the Tang. So, covering 600 or so years, and all kinds of documents were in there. And even better for us, many of the documents were things written on the back side of other documents. So you kind of get double your money's worth there on these things. So these were all discovered in I forget exactly when the Chinese man actually first found the cave. It may have been the late 19th, either late 19th or early 20th century. My dates are kind of fuzzy there right now. But, Taoist priest who was a caretaker for this temple cave discovers it, and eventually a couple, three in the end mainly, well, there are more actually, but the three big ones, Western explorers come through there and buy up huge chunks of this material and cart it back to Europe. So the main stores of it now are actually in Britain and in France. The Pelliot and the Stein manuscripts, Pelliot being in France and Stein being in Britain. These things there were lots of them. And Stein in particular, Stein didn't read Chinese, so he had no clue what he was getting. So he got a huge chunk of stuff, but it was somewhat random. And so that particular set took a lot of work to get through. Pelliot did read Chinese, so he was more selective, but it was still a huge corpus of stuff he got. And so it's taken people, he was still exploring this material, to be honest, to see what all it says. But part of what has come out of it is that they have found a whole series of medical texts, many of which were not known. Some of them not known at all. Some of them we had records of in bibliographies from the time. One great thing about China is they kept very good lists of what books they knew about, but that had been lost. And among the ones that was found that we never heard of at all is a book attributed to Tao Hong-jing, the very famous Taoist and doctor who was responsible for the earliest known edition of the Fine Farmer's Materia Medica, the Shenlong Ben Cao Jing. His version was the Ben Cao Jing Jiju, the Materia Medica, classical Materia Medica with collected annotations. So this book has a very long title. It's very hard to translate. So let's just call it the Fu Xing Jue, which is its short title. The Fu Xing Jue is a collection of text, including stuff from different places. One part of it claims to be a section of the Tang Ye Jing Fa, including the place where it refers to the treatment of epidemic febrile diseases, i.e. what would have been known as Shanghan to many people. And I cannot remember on the top of my head if it uses a specific term, Shanghan, or not, although I believe, well, I know Tao Hong-jing, or whoever it was who wrote that, who put this text together, in a comment on the section, clearly indicates that whoever it was, we'll call him Tao Hong-jing, because we don't know if he was or not, we'll just say he was, says that Zhongjing took this material and modified it to make his Shanghan Lun that everybody loves now. I'm paraphrasing. And then Tao gets kind of what's the word I'm looking for? He gets kind of gets a little fit on us and says that because Zhongjing didn't like Taoism very much, he changed the names and used just the ingredients to give them names instead of the original names. Because the original names were all things like, we know, of course, the True Warrior decoction, right? We know White Tiger decoction. Well, a lot of them had names like that. So Blazer Tang was originally minor yang, so Xiao Yang Dan Tang, which is like how we phrase that, sort of minor yang dawn decoction, something along those lines, you could call it. Or, but they all have names like this that are very poetic. And many of those, of course, Zhongjing changes. And Tao Hong-jing has a little bit of spat on us there and is not happy with Zhongjing about this at all. But so at any rate, whoever like made those comments clearly thought this was the text that Zhongjing had used. Some people have disputed whether or not this really is the Tang Ye Jing Fa from the Tang Ye Jing Fa or not. To my eye, it looks like it probably is, and I think, given that we don't have definitive evidence to show that it's not, I'm inclined to say we should trust what the source says unless we've got a good reason not to trust it. So at any rate, that's where it all comes from. It's got a long history. And what you see in it, though, is that a lot of the formulas that are the most famous formulas of the Shanghan Lun do appear in this text in slightly different forms often. And often the indications of the formula are slightly different as well. But it does appear that this is a text that Zhongjing drew upon and then tweaked and then got much more detailed into when do you use it, how do you modify it, because that kind of material is not found in the Tang Ye Jing Fa, at least that we have. So it appears to be the original source of a lot of what Zhongjing did, but Zhongjing clearly built upon it extensively.
Okay. And my understanding from reading part of your paper was that that text didn't actually talk about cold damage. It was more about kind of what we might say are aberrations of heaven qi causing illness. Is that correct?
I would have to go back into the original text to see if it says the word cold damage or not.
Oh, okay.
The thing is, at this point in time, many people, although admittedly not all people, were using Shanghan cold damage as a synonymous with terms like heavenly movement, which is her way of referring to epidemics. And like if you look, for instance, in Ge Hong's Zhou Hofang, the formula to keep close at hand, he's of the opinion that basically Shanghan is the learned way of saying this, and heavenly movement is the commoner's way of saying this. And so it seems like most likely, regardless of whether it says Shanghan or not, that's what we're talking about essentially here.
Okay, thanks.